Welcome to our series, Responding to the Sacred, Inclusive Liturgies, Porous Walls, New Conversations. After hosting an online conference in 2021 called Responding to the Sacred, Gender and Liturgy in Conversation, today and this week we're offering a new series of conversations in partnership with the Scottish Episcopal Church's Liturgy Committee. We hope these will create space to think and talk about a more inclusive liturgical imagination and practice. Many people currently shy away from our churches and their worship. Perhaps they don't feel welcome as they are or with what they bring. In this conversation, my guests work from the perspective of practical theologians, tasked with, in Heather's words, doggedly seeking to resource those who would lead worship, pastor the faithful, and maintain the shrines in creditable working order. It's work that is bound at the same time not to flinch from looking at how churches in our contemporary context often struggle to see beyond the shrines, the faithful, and the worship of generations, to the dust and rubble into which many of them are falling. Heather and Wren are interested and challenged by the idea that this dust and rubble could be both toxic wilderness and also at the same time a context for vibrant new birth and more inclusive understanding. And so my guests today are Professor Heather Walton, who is a professor of theology and creative practice. Heather is a former president of the International Academy of Practical Theology and co-convenes the doctorate in theology through creative practice at Glasgow University. She's also a regular preacher. Dr. Wren Radford lectures in liberal arts and theology at the University of Manchester and teaches and publishes on interdisciplinary areas of literature and theology. Wren has been involved in developing several creative arts-based collaborations with community groups, reflecting on issues around inequality, activism, and the role of lived experience in social change. In this conversation, Heather and Wren will talk about how a series of images impact on their ongoing work of responding to the sacred. So at this point, I will hand you over to Heather.
Thank you, Alison. Wren, it's grand to have this chance to spend time talking to you. I always find you such an inspiring person, and you are also a dear friend. But in the normal run of things, we don't often make time to speak about what is keeping us going at this strange work of responding to the sacred, which is our shared vocation, I guess. And when we were discussing how we would focus this conversation today, we both felt the weight of the task that we've been set to somehow address inclusive practices taking place in a context when the sanctuary walls have become porous. Porous is a nice way of putting it, I would say, when the sanctuary walls are increasingly broken and roofless. And that's quite a brutal challenge, actually. We're confronting what it means to perform liturgically in a situation of ruination. And when we were thinking about this, we started tentatively sharing stories that contained images that all seem to centre upon a wee phrase from recent work in performance studies, staging the wreckage. We thought we could focus on this phrase and what it opened up for us as a lead into our conversation, which will include a discussion of why we both lean towards creative practices in our work. So I would like to start by sharing my story image, and I admit it's a bit of a strange one. Several years ago now, I became really challenged and drawn into the story of the 12th century intellectual, theologian, and religious leader, Eloise. She's popularly known mainly through romantic retellings of her devastating love relationship with the more famous Abelard. And it is a tragic tale. The lovers contravened the social, religious, and familial power structures of the time. And in what might be described as an honour feud, Abelard was attacked and castrated, and both partners entered the vowed religious life. But the story didn't end there, and in a sense it becomes more interesting. Eloise quickly became the leader of her community of nuns, but struggled with her vocation, and in particular the loss of her erotic intimacy with Abelard. Whereas Abelard urged her to be reconciled to her new life, she regarded what had happened to her as a disaster, a wounding, and she didn't hesitate to call God into account for this cruel blow. So this is the first important thing. Eloise is a woman of faith and always a believer, but she names what intellectual and personal conflicts this entails, and she doesn't seek to hide her grief or loss, her wreckage, if you like. And the second important thing is that she seeks a liturgy that speaks to her situation as it is, and not some fantasy of the religious life. Now, Abelard was known for his musical and poetic gifts, and so Eloise asks him to compose for her community a new corpus of liturgical material that they can use with honesty. For, she says, so much devotional material is based upon inauthentic expressions, requiring worshippers to lie about their true feelings and experiences. Furthermore, it should include, she instructs, those difficult elements of tradition that are neglected in worship, such as the slaughter of the innocents. Finally, in remembering the examples of holy women, it should include, and I quote, respecting those who were not at all virgins or martyrs. And Abelard responded with a remarkable outpouring of sacred songs. There are hymns that recall the darkest elements of the biblical tradition, particularly those that are articulated through women's voices. The lamentation of Rachel weeping for her children, the sacrifice of Jephthah's daughter, Mary mourning her dead son. There are songs that employ deeply erotic images and use them with unprecedented passion. In fact, the breath of lovers is everywhere in these devotions. The work echoes the urgent voices of separated partners in the Song of Songs, and also speaks David's lament for Jonathan. And often it's the woman's subject position that is taken. Women are the speakers to God in this liturgical corpus, rather than in Carol Chris' famous phrase, slotting them sideways into a story in which the daughters don't exist. So yes, I know these works were written by a man. They are not Eloise's creations, and perhaps if they had been, some of the consolations that are present within them would have been tempered somewhat. She had a very bleak view. But they are radical nonetheless, and they were created at her instigation, and they do address the challenges she raised. More than this, they are poetry, music, creative art. Abelard was an artist theologian who was able to take stock of an awful situation of desolation and to enter it, stage it, inhabit it liturgically. More than 800 years ago, in a cold chapel at dawn or late at night, walls etched by the moving shadows of candlelight, there was a liturgical performance of anguish before God. I'm not confident that this is happening. This liturgical staging of wreckage is happening very much within our sanctuaries today. But maybe it is beyond the walls, in art, in poetry, in creative work.
This is a really important discussion for us to be having, and not least because this question of staging the wreckage has been such a shared concern of ours. So I'm grateful to have some time unpacking this. I think it's something that has moved both our work forwards and continues to see us somewhat restless in our search for things that do justice, but also always being aware of the limitations of the justice that is done in those spaces. For me, it provokes concerns around how we, as troubled and troubling theologians, we present and represent the realities of trauma, violence, and harm to individuals, communities, people groups, and ecosystems, and the way that these ethical and theological questions are so deeply intertwined in what it means to put forward a performance of that wreckage. How do we refuse ways of presenting the wreckage that reinforces terror and harm, acknowledging that there will always be a differential impact across race, gender, sexuality, class, disability, and global location? How can we make sure that we take responsibility for that staging whilst also enabling open questions and engagements, the provisionality of very public work? How do we ensure that the staging acknowledges the ongoing legacies of wrecking, not just wreckage staged as past, but continuing movement, recognizing that sometimes reporting and archiving and describing wreckage can be a way of noting and moving quickly on, seeking to easy a closure. In performance studies, work such as Sandra Perry's Typhoon has been noted as a kind of work that holds open this space. This was an installation performance work, and in many respects, it responds to Turner's painting of the Zong disaster, but chooses to recreate only Turner's waves without his voyeuristic focus on the bodies of enslaved people that have been thrown overboard, treated only as economic value in the claim on their death, not just their life. By refusing to stage the bodies of enslaved people, Perry aims to stage the wreckage not simply as a past event, but to draw attention to the ongoing intertwining of racial capitalism and colonialism. This staging is about foregrounding the mechanisms of imperial violence and is what Christina Sharp calls wake work, attending to the violence of anti-Blackness in the present and the way its disruption troubles mourning, troubles the ways that most museums and memorials, and I think Christian theologies and liturgies, take up trauma and memory. Sharp's work is really detailed and a beautiful exploration of the everydayness of these experiences of wreckage, whilst also discussing many installations and pieces of visual art that stage this violence and wreckage, drawing attention to the question of how one memorializes what is still unfolding. Mainstream churches in the UK are beginning to acknowledge their role in the enslavement trade and are often looking for critical and creative responses to this. Yet such responses can also risk speaking over existing liturgical and prophetic voices that are speaking out around whiteness, race, and racism in the church at present. I think here of my friend Azariah France Williams and his work on Ghost Ship, but also their continuing work in Manchester in staging the community festival Come What May at Ascension Church that works through music, dance, food, learning and liturgy to celebrate and explore the community's stories of Windrush and their work of anti-deportation activism. I think similarly here of Anna Fisk's discussions of prophetic climate movements and the ecological activism often stages the precarity of the climate crisis. But in this, there is a way of staging the wreckage through the image of the clock that can reinforce both Western linear time and the feeling that it may already be too late. Anu Ranawana's work here on the intertwining of race, colonialism and ecology also draws us into these liturgical and ecological spaces. So here I think we are talking about refusing kinds of liturgies that respond to the wreckage as a site of closure, and seeking instead to attend to continuing and ongoing processes of violence and trauma. And seeking not to position these as an ongoing form of enacting terror on people, but recognizing the agency and resistance of those made most precarious by colonial, racialized state and ecological disasters.
Mm. Thanks, Wren. I do so agree that we are seeking liturgies or responses to the sacred that refuse a sort of redemptive closure, a peace at last, where actually we're in the middle of things and there is no peace. I think we also need creative resources that help us really acknowledge the ruination of theology, of worship, of our religious communities in these days, and that enable us in that famous Donna Haraway phrase, not only to acknowledge the troubles, but to stay with the troubles for a while at least. So I'd like to return us to sanctuaries and their walls or lack of them again. in sharing about something that haunts my imagination when I think of staging the wreckage. So just outside Glasgow, where I live, there's a ruin. It's the ruin of St. Peter's Seminary, Cardross. It was opened in 1966 and it closed only 14 years later in 1980. It's a building, I think, of remarkable beauty, or remarkable ugliness, say other people. I think this depends on your response to brutalist architecture. It's been compared to a modern factory, clean-lined, flooded with light, efficient, productive, with multiple side chapels allowing for masses to be celebrated simultaneously all day, every day. And it was heralded as representing the Catholic Church's confident response to modernity and an investment in what was envisaged as the perpetual work of training young men for the priesthood. So why did it close? It closed so soon. Too few vocations, too little money, too modern to house tradition, too beautiful to be useful, too ugly to be tolerated, too male, so far from people. The light bulbs had to be imported from Sweden. Or something even bigger and more substantial than this. The cultural theorist Brunella Tor writes of remaining a religious observer, of attending Mass, in a culture that's lost all appreciation of traditional modes of responding to the sacred. What makes what was once so meaningful become so utterly meaningless, he asks. Altogether we pray in the shadow of a rubbish tip that's as high as a hill, ready to come streaming over us. The staging of the wreckage these ruins of St. Peter's represent for me is particularly vividly illustrated in two contrasting representations of the seminary in film. And interestingly, they're both directed by the same Scottish filmmaker, Murray Grigger. So the first of these films, Space and Light, was filmed in 1972, and it shows the seminary at the pinnacle of its short life. It begins with shots of clouds and sunlight and trees and angles of the building. And gathered around are small groups of young men informally talking, and it's spring or summer, and the mood is upbeat. The film then progresses to follow the seminarians through their days as they leave their bedrooms, as they go along the corridors to study, attend lectures, receive communion, engage in private devotions and leisure pursuits. A shorter sequence shows the lives of the nuns who work in the seminary, and we enter their beneath stairs world of cooking and cleaning and praying. And the film closes as the camera pans out to place the seminary in the greenery of the Firth of Clyde landscape, like a perfect small living organism functioning in its native habitat. It's a sort of Corbusian dream. The second film, Space and Light Revisited from 2009, is in dialogue with the first production to the extent that it includes the original film, which is intended to be viewed simultaneously and in tandem with new footage. So there's two screens side by side, and each site that the camera originally visited is paired with a corresponding site in the contemporary ruin. And the contrast between these vistas is heightened as the second film is shot in winter, with snow falling in some scenes. So the corridors the priestlings walked down and the library where they studied are now not safe and orderly spaces, but encroached by wildness and scrawled and overscrawled with graffiti. There's broken beams and fallen mortar which obstruct the camera views. The chapel roof lies open and the altar is broken. In the final scenes, as the camera pans out, the viewer confronts a sort of dissolution of form and order as the building merges into the landscape. So what do I take from this creative staging of the wreckage? It shows us something powerful and stark that is a vivid metaphor for our own ruination. And we need to see this. We really do need to see this. It's two vistas side by side. But my response moves beyond the elegy, the lament that Grigor may have intended to present, because the seminary was simply too clean, too ordered. It wasn't inclusive. Its walls weren't porous. And so ultimately, I'm glad they've fallen. I'm glad the windows have blown out and that the weeds have entirely engulfed the kitchen where the nuns worked. Respect existence or expect resistance, reads one piece of graffiti. And the image of a young woman has been painted in the chapel, where she celebrates a mass of rewilding where once no young woman could have stood. This ruined seminary has in fact become a site of sacred responses, of wilderness wall art, and of resilient growing things.
Thanks, Heather. Now, in response, I want to offer my own image of a ruin, which is one not of a seminary, but of a different sacred ruin, that of a pub. And this ruin is at the southern end of the famous Curry Mile in Manchester, where I live. And there's been a large pile of bricks gradually being cleared. I've seen this take place as I get the bus to work most days, most weeks. Some of the red bricks are painted white on one side with the occasional stark black line crossing them. The slowly reducing rubble is that of Hardy's Well, which bore the poem of the same name written by Lemon Sisay, and it was hosted on the gable end of the pub. The poem is, or was, I'm not sure how one speaks of a poem that is both destroyed and enduring, but the poem was littered with words beginning with W, promising the wonders of the well as wilting the wallpaper of work and worry, offering an alliterative tongue twister to locals and passers-by, perhaps a challenge for people as they came out at the end of the night. 200-year-old pub had been adorned with the poem in 1994 when Lemon Sisay, who was a regular in the pub, had been challenged, not by a nun like Abelard was, but by the landlord to write a poem for the pub after Lemon Sisay had declared that poetry should be more widely seen. And this poem marks the first of Sisay's landmark poems. And his words and poems are now placed across public spaces in Manchester and the UK. Another of the interesting sites of his poetry is that of the poem Guilt of Cain, which is embedded on a sculptural piece and addresses the UK's role in the enslavement trade and is located in the heart of the City of London. So like Abelard, Sisay had received a commission for this poem as well, The Guilt of Cain, and it was meant to celebrate end of the enslavement trade and mention the role of Wilberforce. Yet Sisay is considered to have somewhat reframed this commission, and particularly in the opening performance, he changed the nature of who and what is commemorated, particularly as he sought to trouble the fact that the city continues to benefit from the legacies of slavery, whilst also trying to celebrate this end and the role of Wilberforce in bringing this about, rather than thinking about the lives and voices that were harmed and marginalised in the continuing processes of colonialism. The work picks up a number of biblical allusions. So Cain is both sugar cane and Cain of Cain and Abel. But also uses the language of the city's stock exchange, and he addresses these acts of violence and exclusion, the continuing economic benefits of colonialism, and the continuing racism in the kind of capitalist practices that we have in this country. Returning to Hardy's Well, Sisay is noted as saying to reporters about the destruction that when the poem first went up in 1994, poetry was not commonly placed on the side of public buildings. And he stated it became a landmark, and that's not something you can simply make happen. People make landmarks. Sisay's poetry often works through a play of typographic placement, and the nature of kind of homophones and rhythmic alterations in his work tend to draw in the public to a playful interaction, an invitation to sound the poem out aloud or to touch the words where they have been created with the materiality and the place. And so this interplay of these different actions of text, place, material, and the public operates to kind of produce multiple meanings and unanticipated and haphazard repeated performances. Scrolling through social media and local news, these images of the demolition show a clouded sky against the jagged line of the ruined brickwork, cutting through the middle of words and phrases, again changing the material and symbolic nature of the work. Painting a poem on a wall or embedding it into the pavement raises questions about the publicness of art and liturgy, its materiality and situatedness. The instance of the rubble also raises questions about the publicness of land, who owns that land and what it will become, the kinds of new builds that are going up so frequently in Manchester and other cities, which raises questions of access to affordable and quality housing, spaces to rest and play. In this city, so many industrial buildings were abandoned, but have now been reclaimed as a sellable past in the gentrification of the city. For me, this image of Hardy's Well and its ruin raises questions about the publicness of our liturgies, what assumptions are made about the kinds of publics that are engaged, and how it might be possible for meaning to be formed in multiple, open-ended and playful interactions. But the razing of the building also leads to further questions about how and whether such publicness, poetry and liturgy itself can be ruined, made rubble, destroyed, and can sit in and with these acts of destruction as a mode of witnessing.
You're talking about demolition and the politics of the contemporary city and what endures amongst rubble reminds me of two things. And the first is Rebecca Solnit's assertion that we actually need ruins. We need to have them amongst us in cities. She asks, what is a ruin after all? It's a place of limits where culture surrenders to nature, marked by vandalism, neglect, or testifying to the machinations of power that routinely wreck our habitations. Ruins become, she writes, the unconscious of the city, its memory, darkness, its lost lands. And I also remember the work of the artist Ansel Kiefer, who works extensively in his art with the debris of destruction. And he says he does so out of a spiritual understanding of wreckage. Wreckage as being the first moment of rebirth, that awful death through which blossom becomes seed. Which is kind of okay to say when we're talking about piles of broken bricks or mortar, or when we're talking metaphorically about cultural dissolution and renewal. But when we're talking about living things that are destroyed, it feels a bit different. So a few months ago, I witnessed a really awful sight. I was visiting my daughter in Plymouth, and it was just after the Conservative mayor of that city had signed off on the nighttime chainsaw massacre of the great trees that lined the city's main thoroughfare a mile away. And it was truly an awful sight. There were great trunks, huge limbs of trees stacked up and left behind a wire mesh fence. And then we were people standing outside the fence, shocked in silence and grief, just looking at these bodies, tying ribbons to the wreckage, posting laments on the fence. And it brought back to me Gerard Manley Hopkins' poems, Binsey Poplars, in which he mourns the felling of some trees he loved. And he writes, "Oh, if we but knew what we do when we delve or hew, hack and rack the growing green, where we, even when we mean to mend, we end. After comers cannot guess the beauty been, 10 or 12, only 10 or 12 strokes of havoc unsolve the sweet, a special scene." It was really a horrible sight, and particularly horrible as this sort of thing happens so often. The case of the thousands of trees that were felled in Sheffield and the politics of austerity and private finance initiatives and corporate irresponsibility at every level that was part of this is truly shocking. Maybe we can see some slight hope in the fact that in Sheffield, the community outrage and indeed the community organisation was so impactful that the council completely reversed its tree policy and Sheffield was recently awarded the status of Tree City on the basis of its turn to tree renewal and conservation. This really is a small glimmer of hope, but sadly it can't obscure our awareness of all the other trees around the world that are being hewn and hacked and wrecked as we speak. And again, this is important where we need art to stage the wreckage. And one of the most important stagings of our mass arboreal destruction recently is Richard Power's novel Overstory. It's a remarkable novel in which our intertwined life and how people respond to the sacred by being moved in mysterious ways, quite literally, by the spiritual claims this shared dimension places on us. This is something really hard to portray in realist terms. And while Overstory is a novel about a real situation, it's not a realist novel in the traditional sense. And it probably couldn't be, because we don't actually have a language or a form beyond those of creative art to speak of the relationality, the radical connectivity, the sacred intercommunion that constitutes the very fabric of being. And that's why the eco-theorist Tim Walton claims that all art is ecological. He says this is because things are mysterious in a radical and irreducible way. Mysterious comes from the Greek muon, which means to close the lips. Things are unspeakable, but art can maybe stage them.
And I think this question of what is sayable and the refusal to romanticize ruins and wreckage as well is really important and takes us to where art and poetry and literature has highlighted this work of continuing ruins, speaking back to some of the traditions in theology, in Christianity, in colonialism that continue to cause ruin and wreckage in different ways. One such is Natalie Diaz's poem, Of Course She Looked Back, which responds to the text in Genesis 19 and continuing interpretations of the passage that depict the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and of Lot's unnamed wife looking back on the wreckage of her home. Letting this unnamed woman take the central role in the poem, Diaz stages her as looking back from afar, and this shivering city is depicted as small and fragile, able to fit in the palm of her hand, able to be blown like a kiss and sent tumbling across the desert. The poem visualizes what she may have seen: pigeons glinting like debris above ruined rooftops, towers swaying, women in broken skirts strewn along burned out streets like busted red bells. The poem also envisions the noise of the wreckage, using unusual pairings of words: dogs weeping, roosters howling, with children and guitars described as being popped like kernels of corn, drawing attention to this distortion of overwhelming noise and violent movement. Like many works of feminist revisioning, a tradition that often takes Rich's poem diving into the wreck as a foundational text, Diaz's poem uses humour to address some of the tyranny of the text and its afterlives, and it depicts the central character wondering if she had unplugged the iron or the coffee pot or accidentally left the oven on. The poem speaks back to the way the passage has been used to legitimise colonial and queer-phobic violence, the way that acts of violence, destruction and neglect are made reasonable, often by laying the blame at those who have suffered the violence, drawing distinctions between deserving and undeserving. This is a staging that points to how the text has been staged also in our ongoing interpretations. And Diaz, as a Catholic and Indigenous writer, a queer woman, seeks to highlight all that is happening in speaking back to these interpretations. The work also problematizes, though, both the act of looking away from and looking at wreckage and sites of violence. Another such site that we might think of and problematise our own engagement of looking at or looking away from is that of the site of Grenfell Tower, the wreckage that still remains after the 2017 fire in which 72 people lost their lives. With the following inquiry, staging the question of what happened in ways that have ultimately reinforced harms for the survivors and placed blame on the community that called Grenfell home. The inquiry is one of the many depictions that failed to do justice in staging the wreckage, that portray Grenfell as a site of the so-called undeserving poor living in unsafe conditions of their own making, rather than, as Robbie Shilliam notes, focusing on the resistances and creativities being enacted in a multi-faith, multiracial community shaped by traditions of informed and articulate critical citizenship. This trauma and inequality that has been highlighted in Grenfell and its aftermath have been staged by a number of UK poets like J. Bernard, who has linked Grenfell to the New Cross fire of 1981 and has based this on their work in North London archives. In an essay come manifesto, Bernard writes, "You can go from New Cross to Whitechapel, then switch to Hammersmith and City Line, and then to Latimer Road Station. As you pull in, you'll see the tower's remains. For the first few days after the fire, thousands of people gathered to mourn, and I went down too. Everyone I knew was there, and we met each other in the street and stood in silence, or looked at each other, or tried to analyse the situation. But at the bottom, there was a strange electricity that always accompanies a gathering of people in the street. A strange sense of possibility that the tower we were standing beneath was a physical manifestation of all that. All the things we said, all the things we felt, everything anyone has ever said, anything anyone has ever felt. The charred spine of a burnt giant jutting into the sky. I am not sure any longer that it is possible to speak about myself without speaking about this." Roger Robinson has also staged Grenfell in his poetry collection, A Portable Paradise, asking about the ways that people in the tower had their possibility of building paradise refused, noting that underneath his concept of paradise is that of prayer. And throughout this collection, he notes small prayers uttered for his child's premature birth, all by the survivors of Grenfell. Noting the inherent queerness in their archival work that enables them to stage the wreckage of Grenfell, of New Cross, and ongoing violence, J. Bernard reflects, "A poet can't deliver justice, but they can ask a different kind of question." And I think this, for me, provokes that idea that the work of liturgy and of theologians is in asking a different kind of question.
Thank you both so much for what you've given us already. That's absolutely fantastic. And I wonder if I might trouble you a little bit longer to answer one or two questions. So first of all, to Heather, I was very interested in what you had to say about Eloise's frustration with the liturgy she'd inherited and the reason why she asks Abelard to write some new material. Because I do think this is where the idea for our conversations and discussions originally started, with people feeling that they weren't able to reflect their real experiences and their true experiences of who they were through the language that they were given in our worship. I wonder whether that idea of contemplating the wreckage is therefore, thinking about Eloise's suffering and her own personal wreckage, is that necessary? Do we have to have this? Is this the only place for rebirth? Do we need to suffer through contemplating the wreckage?
I got Eloise talking in my head as I listened to you. I mean, she's a very forthright person, and she would say basically, no, of course, this is a cruel, stupid way of going about organising the universe. But nevertheless, this is where she is. She is in a situation where her hopes are dashed and her loves are denied and her being is thwarted. And in that situation, she's an extremely honest person. And she says, I just don't want to worship through lies. I need words that enable me to speak the truth of my experience. And it's really interesting because she's not actually asking for Abelard to invent a new tradition or to kind of, in a sense, give her different stories. She's asking to inhabit the story authentically. and to be able to dwell on those parts that are so often missed out, and to enter the depths in an authentic way. And before I ever knew of Eloise or whatever, I had a very similar sort of feeling. I've often spoken, written about my experience of infertility. It happened when I first began teaching theology, and I was preparing people for ministry. I was hearing people worship. I was leading worship myself, preaching, and going out and visiting local churches. And my experience of personal anguish was just not reflected in the worship traditions I was experiencing. It was just, there is a problem if you're not happy, basically, and it's your problem. And I kind of started to preach differently. And I started to talk about my experience in my preaching and in my liturgies, and not just my experience, but the experience of others that I knew were similarly wrestling with anguish. That was a learning experience for me, and a learning experience that you could tell the truth in church, which I think many people still think you can't, but I actually would like to say you can. But also, and this is hard for me to put into words, but I'm going to try. You can connect your personal situation with something beyond yourself. And so that something beyond yourself, I'm not necessarily just meaning God here. I'm meaning a collective experience. I'm meaning the travail that we hear about in Scripture, the whole creation groaning in travail. There's a connection that can be made. And that liturgical connection is so powerful. And I do think that's what Eloise was reaching for in her request to Abelard. And I think I'm going to say that he does have quite a lot of consolations in his liturgies that she may have not received quite as optimistically as he did. But nevertheless, he does name the pain, and he does liturgically respond to that.
That's a powerful way of putting it, naming the pain liturgically. And I also very much like your reflection that she is interested in inhabiting the liturgy and the bits that get left out. And this links for me with what Wren was talking about earlier in relation to Natalie Diaz's rereading of the story of Lot's wife, the bits that are left out in that story. There was countless people who had nothing whatever to do with rape and lynching, and had not displeased God, but nevertheless were consumed in this fiery apocalypse. So thank you. That's a great response. Can I ask now a question to Wren? This one is about Hardy's Well and the Hardy's Well pub in Manchester, which you tell us was put in motion, the whole process of painting the poem on the gable of the pub by the landlord, who thought that very enlightened man thought that poetry should be more widely seen. Wonderful. Do you think that poetry should be more widely seen in churches? And following on from that, what might put a poet off writing poetry in churches and cathedrals? What might exclude the poet from the expression of so much?
Thank you. So I'm always interested by this story. I don't know how true or apocryphal it is, that a young lemon Cisse was sitting drinking, opining about poetry and saying it should be more widely seen, and a pub landlord saying, all right, let's do something about that. Because I like that commission as a charge, as a response to live up to what you're already saying. And I think that idea of poetry being more widely seen in churches and spaces comes with that kind of question that I think the way Cisse's poetry works also questions us. So that idea of the typography, meaning that it has to be sounded aloud, read in different ways, that multiple meanings, and that it's very playful, engage people, it requires a loss of control. on the part of the poet and the commissioner. In many ways, there's a letting go. And I think that's perhaps the challenge in this question of what might put poets off, is the sense of who is in control of the meaning of this. What expression am I allowed to give here? What Heather has just said about certain feelings, certain states of being not being visible in worship, in liturgical spaces, in a sense of the sacred, and saying, actually, these are part of sacred life. Where can they be put? Where can they be experienced, so that there aren't kind of re-exclusions of people? And I think that's the challenge: is can a commission allow for a plurality of meaning, to have multiple feelings in response to a kind of installation or poetry in some way? And what might come of that is one of the really interesting things in performance study that has discussed this staging of the wreckage, is saying that staging can be an attempt to regain control of a narrative when control has been lost in that process of wreck and ruination. So in many ways, it depends on that context of, is this a commission that is attempting to regain some sense of control over the public's imagination of who and what the church and the sacred is? Or is it something that is allowing a wider response and interpretation and a response to the sacred to be taking place?
Indeed, you make a very good point there. In the time that we have left, I know that we're thinking you might say something about the space of limitations in this context.
Yes, I was very interested in Heather highlighting through Rebecca Solnit this question of how ruins bring us to a place of limit, and how liturgy and theology respond to that, and that sense of, is this something where limit can be recognised and appreciated, in that sense of there being an end to words, there being a space that we can't speak into. And I think both Heather and I have written in our work about the importance of unknowing, of silence, and those being a sacred space as well, as opposed to a limit of the sacred, but something that can be brought as part of a creative process as well, into that space. And I think that's important as well. You know, we have said a lot about ruin and destruction and painful things, but also recognise these can't always be spoken about. And I think some of my own work with communities seeking to find ways of staging that silence. So working with a participant who, in a project where we were working with kind of creative journaling and collaborative creative pieces, a person who sent back a blank journal and said, actually, it's too much for me to speak about the experiences that I've been through right now. And so finding in a way for a final creative output to have a blank page with that sense of saying, it's too much. I keep being asked about my experiences and I just don't have anything to say. I feel blank and empty. And so finding space for that in the staging as well.
I'm sure that will resonate strongly with a lot of people. And then finally, Heather, I wonder if you could say something a little bit more about the nature of poetry as opposed to poetics, because I think it's very much a relevant issue in what we've been talking about today.
Something that constantly challenges and provokes me is, what's the relationship between something I do, something I make, a liturgy, a sermon, a life story or whatever, and art or poetics, creative making? You know, is creative making poetics simply the sum of all those things that people make? Or is it something else? And I think basically there is no fixed thing that is art or poetics. It's that thing that functions as the gap or challenge or need that the culture has at that moment. It's that thing that speaks into the silence, and it speaks in all sorts of ways. Often they are semi-articulate, symbolic, image-based, etc. Decolonial theorist Edouard Glissant, also a poet, talks about his work as being to hear the cry that's actually silenced now, the cry of the Middle Passage, but also the cries that are still echoing around the Caribbean, which is the basis of his work. And hearing the cry and noting the absence in the cry. And I think that's kind of the work of poetics, that's the work of art. And with God, it was also the work of the liturgist. But I think we have a way to go.
Thank you both so very much for participating in today's conversation and for all you have shared with us about your professional lives as practical theologians and your wide reading and reflection on issues of liturgy and theology. And I know that the people who listen will have gained a great deal in the course of this reflection. So thank you both very much indeed.